Well, good morning and welcome to our Q&A session on FTC safeguards and cybersecurity. My name is Sean Leibold. I'm Director of Industry Relations here at Reynolds and Reynolds, and I'm joined by a panel of great industry experts. I'm going to start off with Brad Holton, founder of Proton Dealership IT. Thank you, Brad, for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Sean.
Also,
thanks for having me.
Joined by Nikhil Kalani. He's our Chief Information Security Officer here at Reynolds and Reynolds. And also graciously joining us via Zoom is Brad Miller, who's our Chief Regulatory Counsel and Digital Affairs and Privacy Officer at NADA. So good morning, gentlemen, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Brad Holton, I'm gonna kick off to you real quick. Can you kind of set the stage where we're at and why we're having this Q&A session this morning?
Sure. So in the last several years, we've seen in the industry, in the automotive world, tons of increases in cybersecurity breaches, events, ransomware attacks, all sorts of events that are really putting a lot of pressure on dealers to improve security and to protect data. And I think the FTC has also, obviously been watching all of that. And so they've come out with their updated safeguards last October. That basically requires dealers to start taking cybersecurity very seriously and puts a whole list of criteria out there that dealers need to make sure they're doing to protect data and to protect the environment inside their network. So those two things together are really kind of driving a significant conversation about how dealers approach cybersecurity, how they need to address and change things in order to comply with this new regulation. And of course, we're also seeing a significant change in cyber insurance right now as well, as a result of all those breaches, and that's really putting a lot of pressure on dealers. So that's kind of what's making this the hot topic. And dealers I talk to all the time go to 20 groups, they go to state association meetings, whatever, and they always come back and cybersecurity and someone being breached and somebody having a ransomware event, some dealer being down for a week is always a hot topic. We kind of refer to that as the loudest secret out there because nobody wants to talk about it, but everybody knows it happens. So I think that's really kind of what makes this a hot topic for dealers right now.
That's great. And Brad Miller, from your perspective, how would you answer that same question on why are 3 of us or 4 of us getting together this morning to talk about this very serious issue?
Sure. Yeah, and I think specifically from a regulatory perspective, what's driving this, in addition to what Brad said in terms of the overall increase of focus on data security, the FTC specifically has changed the rule that applies to dealers. Okay, so dealers are regulated. In our industry, dealers are the regulated entity. It's not the OEM, it's not the dealer vendors, it is the dealers because they are deemed to be financial institutions under federal law. And as a result of that, they're subject to a statutory mandate and a specific data security rule called the FTC safeguards rule. And as Brad mentioned, they amended that rule very significantly last year. And the date that I want folks to remember is December 9th of this year. That is the deadline for compliance with these a litany of specific new requirements that the dealers have to meet, and frankly, many vendors and service providers of dealers also have to meet by December. So it's not, the overall theme and the overall atmosphere has definitely changed, as Brad has mentioned, but specifically, we've got this statutory mandate that's really driving activity in 2022, and it's going to continue because it's not a one-time set and forget. It is do it and then make sure you're amending it, updating it, and keeping up with it. As this arms race will go on forever, and it's the kind of thing that dealers are not going to be able to just, okay, I've checked that box, now I can move on. You really have to change the way you do your business. And dealers come to grip with that, and it's a big change.
Nikhil, I'm going to throw that question at you as well, because obviously you do a great job of protecting Reynolds in that same world. Why do you think we're here today?
So let's tie a couple of things together. Brad talked about technical security, right? Defending against attacks. The FTC wants this as well for the consumer protection. So they've got regulations that are very prescriptive. And so our goal here is to tie together this combination of related but separate topics. There's true security, technical security, and then complying with regulations. And we'll work through both of those and see how they fit together. And how a dealer can then help themselves from a technical perspective, as well as meet their compliance obligations.
That's perfect. So I'm gonna break it down a little bit, and I'm gonna throw the question to the two of you. So why and what do cyber attacks in the automotive industry look like?
Nowadays, the way modern attacks work, It's very easy for the attacker. They send an email, the unsuspecting user might click on a link or open an attachment that's malicious. Now, this attack is starting from inside the network. 10 years ago, the attack came from the outside trying to get through your firewalls. That's all gone. The attack's now inside the network. The attacker has a foothold on that one PC from which they'll start to explore what else do you have on the network, right? Let's look around. Let's see what else we can get. As they find resources, they don't begin to encrypt them right away. The first thing they want to do is steal information. And what happens with this is now, even if you can recover from their next step, which is encrypting all of your infrastructure, even if you can recover via backup, they still have the information, so they can extort you for the data breach, because you have to release information to your consumers, make reputational loss. So they can extort you for that breach if you are able to recover from their next step, which is encrypting the infrastructure. And if you can't recover from that, well, they got you there too. And so the typical play out is they want to know how much your cyber insurance policy will pay out. And coincidentally, that's exactly how much they want from you. And they will give you a decryption key if you pay the amount.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Brad.
So, in Vegas at the last NADA, we did a presentation on cybercrime. And we came up with about 6 stories that were real breaches, real attacks that dealers had gone through. And we had to turn it in, to get to the legal review at NADA in I think August, even though presentation wasn't until, spring. By the time spring came and I got up on stage, I said, okay, these are great 6 stories, but I've got 18 more stories that happened since these 6 stories were turned in. So, it's something that we see constantly. And we call it incident response. And this is when we get a call from a dealer that's been referred to us and, who's in the middle of a breach, or it's just started, or maybe they've even been down for a week. I mean, we had one call where a dealer had been down for almost 2 weeks. When I say down, I mean down. No email, phone system wasn't working. It was limping along. Couldn't get their DMS working. All their files were gone. Computers didn't operate. It's a consistent problem we see. And when it does hit, it is not something that's going to be a 2-hour or even a 2-day inconvenience.
I'm sure they love going back to paper and pens, right?
I mean, everybody loves the Foursquare, right? Get out and
right.
Start trying to work a deal. In today's dealership, I mean, you cannot do anything without a computer. You really can't. Okay. I mean, everything's in the CRM, it's in the DMS, all your desking tools. Everything is electronic. There's just no way to do it. So, as Nikhil was saying, the double extortion, process, we see that all the time where everything's ransomed and then they take the data as well and then they exfiltrate that back to you over the dark web. It's consistent, it's ongoing, and I would say probably at least twice a month we know of dealers that get referred to us in some way going through this experience.
So one more point I'd add is the timing of these attacks. They want to attack you when it's going to hurt the most. So before a big holiday weekend, before the big sale, nights and weekends,
Yep.
Especially before the big sale, are prime moments for the attackers.
Sure. Most vulnerable, right?
Most vulnerable,
Yep.
most profitable for them.
All good points. And let me just, from a legal perspective, let me add a couple things. First of all, one of the requirements in the new safeguards rule is that dealers by December have to have a written incident response plan. And Brad sort of alluded to that. It's one of the things that makes this sort of a pain to comply with, but it's a very good idea. Because frankly, if you are not prepared, if it's Friday, as Nikhil said, Friday before the big, Labor Day sale, and all of a sudden you're getting a ransomware demand, if you don't even know if, the dealer's on vacation or no one knows who's going to be responsible for taking what steps, you're in real trouble. So the written incident response plan in part requires you to think about what you're going to do in advance should something happen. And that's a very valuable step. Now, it's not going to protect you necessarily, but at least it will get you back on the road to being up, hopefully sooner than, as Brad mentioned, 2 weeks. Because you got to know, are you going to notify law enforcement? Are you going to notify your outside counsel, your IT professionals? Are you going to just say, forget it and restart your old system? Are you going to pay the ransom? And I'll tell you, legally, there's been some change from the federal government. This is a very interesting area because there's a question now as to whether it's even legal to pay these ransomware payments. Something that you got to really think about with your lawyer beforehand. But just remember, these are not good guys that are doing this. These are often nation state actors. And many of them are what's called the specially designated nationals list under the OFAC rules. And if you pay a ransomware to someone who's on the OFAC list, you could have some legal, liability to yourself. So you're in a catch-22 where you've had this issue, and if you're not prepared, you're in deep trouble. But even if you are prepared, you've got to make some hard choices with your lawyers about how you're going to handle it, just from a practical perspective. So just a couple of thoughts. Again, not to make this even worse, but it's better to know these things beforehand, before the disaster strikes than after.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of dealers, you really got to think of that incident response. How far do you really need to get down into the weeds there and figure it out? You need to go pretty far. A good example, we had a dealer called in Monday morning. This was a couple years ago, but called in Monday morning, got referred to us. He was in the middle of a ransomware attack, and they didn't have any incident response plan, didn't have any conversation internally. So he had this is a large group, multiple stores. And all the employees went around telling everybody, all the customers, we're in the middle of a ransomware event right now. And so a woman came to pick up her car, couldn't get her car, was told we're in the middle of a ransomware event. We'll get to you when we can. We don't have any computers at work. Within 2 hours, the local TV station had that little thing going up out of the top of the van you never want to see in the parking lot. All right, and the dealer calls me back and he says, hey, I know you guys are just getting started, kind of, engaging with us and getting everything working, but I've got a reporter sitting right here in my office. What do I say? It's like, he actually put me on the phone with the reporter and said, could you please talk? Because I don't know what to say. It was pretty bad.
And I'll tell you, it's one of it's not only required, but it's one of the good ideas. Legal counsel, your press strategy, your notification of law enforcement. I'll tell you, there are some good federal law enforcement resources. Federal agencies that deal with these things actually, in many cases, know know the actors involved. They know whether they're the kind of folks who will after you pay the ransomware, will they then go into extort you a second time? They can give you some guidance. They can actually give you some technical tools to help address the specific encryption, maybe even encryption key. So, it's always better to, it's a question you really got to think through, not just with your lawyer, but from a business perspective, but it can really help, mitigate the effects of these if it happens.
Yeah, we worked with the FBI Cyber Task Force several times, and really sharp guys. They really do, care a lot and give some really good guidance through the whole process.
It's amazing we're having these kind of discussions when dealers want to sell cars and they want to service cars, but we're talking about all the things that, are most scary probably in today's world. So one of your earlier points, Brad Holton, you'd mentioned, how things had changed from, one speech to the next from an NADA perspective. So it kind of blends into this next question that I created before we came on here. So as these threats, they come and they go, but they're going to continue to get more sophisticated, right? Because they're just going to get smarter, as we've seen over the course of time. IT people that do ransomware and things like that, they just get more sophisticated and smarter. So what can dealerships do to protect themselves and to stay ahead of that curve, per se, and not be reactive, but more proactive in this space?
So, one of the things we see a lot is they're not just getting more sophisticated, they're also getting more automated. And the difference there is that you can see a bot network that will attack millions of targets, millions of individuals in a matter of an hour at zero cost to a hacker. So
explain bot network real quick.
Okay, so for instance, you might see a toolkit that's taken over some servers or taken over a bunch of devices. So malware has gotten on these devices. Yep. They then use these devices to launch coordinated attacks. It might be email where they're sending out millions of spam messages. Now the spam messages, they all contain, some sort of unique attachment. Someone clicks on it, it then dumps their entire mailbox. All right, so it takes, let's say for instance, you click on something that you shouldn't be clicking on, and you don't have good endpoint detection, you don't have good tools in place. So you click on it, you see this little box, and then it goes away. You don't think anything else about it, something went wrong. That's about as far as you got, all right? What this actually did in the background, the first thing it did was dump your entire inbox. And it dumps not just your contacts, but your actual conversations. It's then gonna go to all conversations you've had in the last 90 days, and it's gonna reply to all those people. And with that reply is gonna be, okay, it's from you, right? And the subject line is something that you've typed. Yeah. The text is something you've typed. And then it's gonna have a little note that says, hey, please see the attachment and reference this conversation, right? Somebody's gonna then get that, all your contacts are gonna get that. And because it's social engineered to feel like it comes from you, they're gonna click on it much more likely. When they do, the process starts over. Their inbox gets dumped. Yep. Well, while the inbox is getting dumped and all this is going on, they're also scanning your network, dumping your Chrome passwords, dumping every password you've got on there, scanning the network, going and looking laterally to try to attack. So it all starts with that one little email click. But the entire process is fully automated. So we're seeing it now millions of times versus 3 or 4 years ago, it might be one guy who loads up 1,000 targets and then tries to attack 1,000 people simultaneously. Now fully automated, millions at a time. So what do? The first thing you do is you look at email, all right? Better than there's statistics all over the place. Some say 85%, 95% of the initial threat vector is coming in through email. Right, because to Nikhil's point earlier, you used to have attacks to the firewall and try to get in the network. Now it's much easier to use the weakest link inside the network that already exists. That's the human factor. Sure. Right, you've always got the weakest link between the chair and the keyboard. All right, so that's where it's going to start. Putting good tools in place to prevent email, good spam, geo-block countries. If you're getting email, from countries that you're not doing business with, stop getting email from countries you're not doing business with. Right. All right, there's no need for it. So let's restrict it down, block it down. Put some policies and procedures in place. Educate your employees. Get security awareness training. Make sure we're doing common sense things. Are we changing passwords? Do we have passwords? You'd be amazed at how many dealers I can walk into and I can go sit down at an F&I computer, and there's no password. Just hit a button. There you go. It's up, and I can see the last deal that was up right now.
Sure.
So if you take physical security seriously and you have a policy to protect deal jackets, then why wouldn't you have a policy to protect all your information in your systems as well? So start working through some of that stuff. Cyber insurance is always a requirement. At least it should be. Most of the OEMs now are starting to address that. So make sure you've got tools like that in place together, and then put everything into a common program. A information security plan that identifies what you have, where your weaknesses are. Do a risk assessment. There's a lot of different things that dealers need to be doing. And I know this sounds overwhelming because I just went through 26 things in 45 seconds.
Right.
And it is a lot. And it's something that dealers have to recognize is not the same old thing they've been doing. Correct. Bob's computer repair and the IT guy that also happens to be the porter or the parts manager is not the tool you need right now. It's not the resource you need. Correct. Right. This is a cybersecurity issue that is addressed by some sort of cybersecurity functionality, whether you hire it internally, whether you outsource it, but it's different than Bob. It's just a totally different game. So I think having dealers understand that and start to look at all those pieces is really kind of what kicks this off.
I agree. And Nikhil, you want to kind of hit on how can we kind of stay ahead of that curve as we move forward and they get more advanced in how they're going to attack?
Sure. As much as the bad guys keep getting more advanced, the basics can really help. Right, so it is a complex issue, but it can be broken down into some basic building blocks. And if done well, these will be a pretty solid defense. So let's talk about people, process, and technology. The people have to be well educated. They're the ones opening these emails, right? So if the people are well educated, cyber aware, they're not likely to be as susceptible to these scams. So that's your first defense. Inside Reynolds, we call it the human firewall. Right. You must have good, basic, sensible policies, what to do, what not to do. That serves as a guide to your people, along with the cybersecurity education. Your IT layer is a very fundamental layer. Good, basic IT hygiene, right? Keeping systems up to date, running on current software, constant patching, monitoring for failures of patching, addressing them, good backups. All of that together gives you a layer on which you can add security. Without a strong IT layer, security can't work anyway, right? You're trying to secure these IT systems. So now when we get to security, the core tools, Brad already talked about email. That's a critical tool to have done well, a good email filter, good firewall. One of the main tools is called EDR, endpoint detection and response. Okay, so this action by the bad guys is happening at the endpoints, the PCs, the servers. Those are called the endpoints. So the modern antivirus is no longer actually called antivirus anymore. It's called EDR. Sits on this endpoint on the PC, server, etc. It's constantly monitoring for behavior, not signatures like the old school stuff. Right? It's looking for the intention of what's happening on that machine. Is the intention looking malicious? So with that kind of technology, you can thwart attacks because each of these attacks in different businesses, they'll have unique attack files. The idea is to completely evade signature. So signature is no longer a very useful security technique. So it's based on behaviors. And then the third part of that tool is the response part, shutting down the attack in software before it gets very far. And so a good EDR tool will stop the attack within seconds. And then now adding to that, you've stopped the attack, you've got to clean it up, right? The tool will usually do a pretty good job of cleaning it up. But a human layer on top watching what did the tool do, did it respond appropriately, is there additional follow-up action required, that's needed as well. So the tool is to be monitored 24/7 by human beings checking on the whole situation. So that's the tool layer. And then wrapping all of this up, your employee education, your IT, your security, your cyber insurance policy, wrapping the whole thing up together to form a program gives you a solid defense.
Well, I like building just a basic foundation because like Brad said earlier in his comment, it seems overwhelming to the dealer, right? 26,000 different things that they have to do, but you broke it down in a simplistic, fundamental way. So Brad Miller, I'm going to throw this question at you. So from your role at NADA, can you kind of give us your spin on what does cybersecurity look like in automotive?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a big question. I think the message I'd like to give to dealers listening is that, there is a mindset, and you touched on it earlier, Sean. I sell cars and trucks, I service cars, I'm good at that. That's what I do. That's my core competency, and that's not going to change. The reality that dealers have to face is that cybersecurity awareness and understanding, at least at a basic level, is part of the job. It is part of the deal. They are swimming in very deep waters, and whether they like it or not, there are all sorts of reasons why their feet are going to be held to the fire. And I mentioned earlier that dealers are the regulated entities. Of course, dealer principals or dealer boards, as part of this new rule, there's a requirement to report to the board or to the dealer principal every year on IT issues. Now, why is that? It's because the regulators want to make sure that the folks at the top of the chain and the top of the management of the entity, of the financial institution, have a basic understanding of this. They can't no longer say, oh, look, I hired somebody, I thought they were doing a good job. It's important to have all the tools that Nikhil and Brad were mentioning, and to have, dealers have a history, obviously, of relying on their technology vendors very heavily. I'm not saying that has to change, but a level of understanding really is going to be required going forward. This is part of just doing business these days. It is a cost of doing business. It is a core competency that needs to be developed at the dealership. I know it's changing rapidly, and I know that as the generations change, it becomes easier. But that's the sort of the hard medicine that dealers have to swallow. Is you cannot fail to have a basic understanding of these things. You don't have to be as smart as Nikhil or Brad, but you have to understand the basics. You have to understand the relevance of it and the importance of it to your store, because it's going to hit you in all sorts of ways. Not only enforcement actions, not only private lawsuits if there's a breach, but frankly, it's becoming part of standard contract terms with your OEMs, with your finance sources, with your cyber insurance providers. It's just, the world has changed, and if you haven't changed, you're behind. So, I think that's just the message and the reality. Now, having done this for 15 years, I can see a change, and it's improving. We still have a ways to go, but the message from a dealer perspective, I think, is put this in the center of your core competencies, because it's going to need to be done.
So I'm going to flip it to you, Brad. So from a Proton side, I know you gave one example earlier about the TV truck pulling in, the dealer called you. Can you kind of walk us through what that process would look like in a traditional fashion?
We actually, we'll kind of back up and say, okay, we got the call on that one. I think it was a Monday morning, 7:30, 8 a.m. And it was actually a dealer group that we had given a proposal to earlier that June. This was in December, I think. So we'd kind of been in touch with them, and they called and said, okay, so that stuff you told us that could happen if we didn't completely get everything in place and overhaul, this is what you meant? And I said, yeah, this is what we're talking about. So all we knew at that point was something was wrong. Not a single computer worked. All the servers, everything, email was down, everything was down. So we got engaged around 7:30 and wake everybody up, get everybody going, and let's get the team going. So, we sent guys to all the stores and tried to figure out, as fast as we could what was going on. We were able to actually, as we were cleaning things up, we were able to trace it back to see how it actually happened. And it had happened through that same email platform I mentioned earlier, where a finance manager had gotten an email he thought came from the controller, clicked on it, saw a little thing pop up, didn't think much about it. Literally just a little rectangle popped up and then went away. That was it was on Thursday about 4:35 when he had clicked on that. And by 4:39, we were able to see that things had already been downloaded on his computer. They were already scanning, and they already dumped all of his email, already dumped his passwords, all that sort of stuff. By Friday, we could see that it was reaching out to other computers, scanning the network. Once again, fully automated still. Nobody was involved. It had already kind of started to penetrate some of the servers. And then Saturday evening, we were able to see in the logs notes that showed that people were actually logging in now from overseas. We knew it was Eastern Europe. Some of the tools they used had Russian and Russian alphabet in it. So we kind of had a pretty good idea who our hacker was. And then once we were able to see the file extensions, the way they encrypted things, we were able to actually drill right down. It was actually a group that was affiliated with the FSB in Russia. It was called Grim Spider, was their online moniker they went by, and it was figured all that out. But the dealer, what he experienced from Monday morning until we'll call it Thursday, he was pretty much not doing anything at all. So we overnighted, I think, 200 PCs. We started wiping PCs that we could, started locking down servers. Basically every single device they had been encrypted. When I say encrypted, they actually encrypted the operating system itself, the user files. So when you tried to turn the computer on and log in, it would just error out. So nothing worked at all. All the servers were gone. Unfortunately, they did not have good backups. Out of all of their stuff, they might have had 10% backed up, 15%, something like that. So we did lose a ton of data. Luckily, they did not exfiltrate data ahead of time. So we were able to go back and look through all the logs, look at the firewall logs, look at all the traffic going out, and we were able to determine that they did not package any data and exfiltrate it out in that case. So we didn't have that double extortion situation, we just had the initial extortion. We wound up destroying just basically everything and starting over. We lit a match and just rebuilt everything. It took about 3 weeks for them to be 100% operational. So by Thursday, we had maybe 2 PCs in each service drive, 1 or 2 PCs in sales, 1 or 2 PCs in finance. We had each business function restored, but it was limping along. And even then, it was very painful. Email had to be completely rebuilt from scratch. It was all gone. So it was just one thing after another that you had to put back together, and you had to prioritize who was going to get what, and it's simple things you don't even think about, like Office, reloading Office on all the PCs, and then all the saved passwords you had on the PCs because everybody just put their passwords in Chrome, and it was just all these pain points that it took to get them back to work. It's a very long process.
So I'll add a little bit more to what Brad said here. Once an attack happens, now is a time where you can't afford to hesitate in how you're going to respond. So the fluency of response is needed. So working with a professional who's done this dozens and dozens or hundreds of times, and who's got the fluency in the tools, no hesitation, that's what's needed during an incident response. It's very difficult otherwise for a business to kind of figure this out if this is the first time they've ever seen this happen.
We've said that if a dealership has the right infrastructure, the right IT infrastructure in place, the cybersecurity pieces in place, how could these attacks be mitigated if they can or can't they? Or they think they're good, right?
Yep, they can, right? So I'll answer in 2 parts. You need to have everything in place: good IT, good security, overall good cybersecurity program. Then you need to test that program regularly. So that's the point of the risk assessments. That's the point of external penetration tests and vulnerability tests. All of those are checking on, is your program actually working? And then those are bundled up as reports and given to the seniors at the dealership so they understand the program's working. Now, in case of a working program, the way it should happen is when the email is clicked on, the tool should immediately shut down the attack right there and then. So what might be a massive situation is over in seconds, maybe minutes. The folks watching on the other end, the 24/7 monitoring, that's part of a good program. Now they'll check, was the cleanup complete? Right? Anything more to do here? Are we good? And end of story, if you've got the right processes in place. Right. If you don't have them in place, then what happens is entirely up to the attacker.
See, I think of the test piece as almost like, and dealers can relate, the old mystery shopping days, right? It's like you get somebody to pretend they're sending you something, or you have somebody mystery shop you, and you get real results from that sort of test, correct?
Oh yes, in fact that works with email, right? You can proactively send test emails that look like real scams. They're quite deceptive, and the idea is, will the users click or not click, right? If they do click, then it's a chance to educate them. You show them, here's what we see in this email. You could have spotted this as a scam yourself. Here's how. And you build up those good habits, good cyber hygiene.
Yep. So we had a dealer that asked us to build a very customized automotive specific phishing attack. And we did. We built it. We didn't tell him when it was coming. We sent it out, I think it was a Monday morning around 9 a.m. We sent it to all of his employees. And it said that you had 7 days to accept the new terms and conditions, or your DMS would stop working. And you needed to click this link to accept the new terms and conditions. And so we sent it out. When you click the link, the page they go to is a browser version that looks exactly like their DMS. But it's very obvious if you look. We left some Easter eggs all around the screen. The website's unsecured. The email itself had spelling and grammar errors on it. So we deliberately kind of made it somewhat obvious. So I called the controller for the group 11 a.m. and said, how's your day going? Just to kind of get feedback and see what the response was. And he said, oh, it's not good. He said, the dealer principal's on the phone with our DMS and he is furious. Apparently we have 7 days to get all of our employees to click on this link in this email and get them to sign in and accept, or our DMS is going to stop working. They only gave us a 7-day notice. And I said, okay, tell them to hang up the phone. That was our phishing email that you wanted us to send you. And by the way, anybody that put their username in, we discarded the password, but we kept the username and added it to a spreadsheet and sent it back to them. And we got 70% of the dealership to give us their credentials to their DMS.
Right. So that's pretty sophisticated, right, Brad? That's very sophisticated. But it doesn't have to be that sophisticated. It can be really simple. Your Amazon package is delayed. Click here to check your package status.
Exactly.
Right? Yep. Everybody gets Amazon packages, right?
Well, and I'll just chime in. I've seen instances, you said 70%, that's a shockingly high number, but I've seen lots of instances where, you do some training, you do an exercise like that, and then if anybody else who falls for the exercise then has to do some follow-up training, and those numbers tend to plummet pretty significantly, pretty quickly. So it's,
it definitely works.
Human nature works both ways as well. And I'll just add one other from a practical perspective, and thinking from a legal perspective as well. You talked about the operational challenges that are raised, but remember that because of the nature of your business, that there is a segment of the data, the non-public personal information is the term of art, the customer data basically that you have, especially in the front end, that is particularly sensitive from a legal perspective. So why do I say that? You mentioned risk assessments a number of times, and that's one of the requirements that dealers must complete by December 9th to do a risk assessment. That means you're looking at all your systems. Where does this stuff live? Who has access to it? What are the risks that could happen based on that access? And I mentioned that because the thought of, dealers have historically sort of had their operations all centralized for a very good reason. But thinking about segmenting networks, keeping that sensitive information in places that are different, because you've got an operational challenge. I mean, if your service lane computers go down, that's bad enough. But if you've then lost the customer information, those are sort of two separate legal ramifications, one operational, one legal. And I would just encourage dealers as they're thinking about it, and vendors, when they're thinking about working with dealers, let's think about ways to segment our network to sort of narrow the damage, narrow the scope, and put, if you've got a castle walls and a moat around your system anyway, to put extra layers of protection around the places where the non-public personal information, the customer information lives, because that's the dynamite from a legal perspective in terms of breach liability, in terms of safeguards liability, and frankly, also for your business. I mean, those are your customers. You don't want them being affected. So again, I'm hopefully not too technical, but I want dealers to think about not just, hey, it's a pain in the neck to open my store on a Monday morning, but I also have to make sure that sort of really sensitive stuff is it's uniquely protected as well. And again, I hate to keep saying this because these are all good ideas, and we've spent 2 years saying that the FTC is making dealers do too much, but these are all things that are basically required under the new rule. I mean, the FTC has kind of said, what they've done basically is they've taken all their enforcement actions from the last 10 or 12 years and said, whatever we made anybody do, we're going to make everybody do it. So there's no, you don't have to go through and see which ones are giving the most bang for your buck. You just have to do all these things. But that said, most of them are still good ideas, certainly individually and collectively. It's hard conceptually. You know, if you're not an IT professional, the nature of data is just, it's just so odd that you can see a piece of paper, you can see a car. The data is just, it exists where it exists, and you have to be much more proactive to make sure that it's limited, that it's segregated, and that it just, you know where it is, and then beyond that, it's not going anywhere else if possible.
No, it's a great segue into the next question, but first, I love the passion that all three of you have around this topic. Obviously, it's something that you're all very versed in and very passionate about in protecting the dealers. So with that, Brad Miller, I'm going to ask you, can you expand and maybe go into a little bit more detail on what is the safeguards amendment look like, and break it down a little bit for our audience as well?
This is a big new rule. This is probably the highest priority issue for the Federal Trade Commission, which is the primary federal regulator for auto dealers in this country, because frankly, it's the thing they get the most complaints about, and it's the thing they get the most pressure from Capitol Hill about, and therefore they respond. And so they have issued a new rule that applies, again, to all financial institutions, including dealers. And it's going to require you to do a number of things. You're going to have to do first of all, you have to appoint a person at your store who's called the qualified individual, who's going to be in charge of all of these things. Okay, so that's point one. Now, is that going to be your office manager? Is that going to be the person who's the current program coordinator? That's a current title under the current rule. There's no real requirement. It doesn't have to be a CISO level expert like Nikhil, but it does have to be someone who's qualified. Okay, and so you appoint this person, and then that person has to ensure you've done a whole series of things. Now, there's a series of technical IT issues like encrypting data at rest and in transit, enacting multi-factor authentication, as some of these folks have mentioned, penetration testing, systems monitoring, those kinds of for internal dealer systems. Now, you get all that set up, then you've got to have 4 documents that you need by December 9th. We talked about a couple of them. One's a written incident response plan. One's an written information security program. One is a written risk assessment. And then one is a written report to your board or your dealer principal. So but those take a lot of work. Now, we put out some guidance. If you're an NADA member, you can get our guide to this rule on our website. It's got templates for all these documents you have to put together, so you're not reinventing the wheel. But this is going to take some real work, and you've got to analyze your systems. And this is all the heart of what this conversation's been about. You've got to know what you have and where this stuff resides and what the risks are in that data. And I think, frankly, when you start digging into these things, hopefully your eyes will be opened a little bit to some of the risks when you think about how dangerous these things are. But they're forcing you to look at it and to put it in writing. And then you've got to do training, and you've got to do some other policy issues. And then you also have to manage your service providers. So including our friends at Reynolds, you've got to go out and make sure that you've got, have your service providers doing some of the same things that you're doing yourself. Now, hopefully a lot of the service providers are doing that. And we certainly in NADA hope that it's going to become a competitive issue amongst the service providers. The folks doing the best job are going to be the ones winning in the marketplace. But again, the reason for that is, remember, the federal government has the ability to regulate dealers, not the vendors. They also realize that a lot of these breaches come through the service provider, right? I mean, famously, the Target breach, we've all heard about all these breaches coming through third-party service providers into the financial institution network. So it's a big lift, and it's a lot to do. If you haven't done it, don't think you can wait till December 1st. You are probably behind the curve, because this is going to take some time. But look, I could spend a long time telling you about the intricacies of this. I encourage dealers, if you haven't, go to our website. We've got a bunch of webinars talking about all this stuff. This is an important thing to do. It is going to be a bit of a pain. It's going to take some work. You're going to need some expertise on the outside. Most likely, you're going to have to work really closely with your vendors. But it's important because it gets you a lot of the things we're talking about today. But now the government's coming and saying you have to do it. That's not always ideal, but it is going to require you to do those things. So, I could go on all day, Sean. I won't do that, but suffice it to say, it's complicated, it's involved, and it's something that you really have to focus on to make sure that you're ready by December 9th.
No, and that's actually perfect, because I know, trying to set this Q&A session up, you've been traveling across the country. You're kind of doing this same, speech and talk. If you're at a coffee break at one of these and you've got a small forum of dealers, what would be like your quick key insights and what would you share with them quickly to make them feel better in regards to sort of the safeguards rule and the amendments?
Sure. Well, I don't know if I can make them feel better, but I do want to make them. I do want to make them understand how important it is. I usually make them feel worse by the time I'm done, frankly, because it's daunting. It is. That said, there's a lot of help. Look at our guidance. It's not, if you were left to do this on your own. I mean, to toot our own horn, if you didn't have NADA's help, it would be very hard. If you didn't have the help of expertise in the marketplace, it would be very, very difficult, because if you don't know this, you don't know what you don't know, right? But you've been given the guidance, get some good vendor help, and put some effort into it. And it's a cultural thing too. It really is. As with all these things, if it comes from the top that this is an important issue, it will get done. Dealer personnel are smart and they're dedicated and they're goal oriented. You give them the right goals, they'll get it done.
One last piece around the safeguard amendment piece and sort of that new term that we're using, qualified individual. Can you kind of break that one down just a little bit more for those that might not understand that term? I know we had a different name for it before, but now it takes on a whole new life.
Yeah, there's all these terminology. It does get confusing because it's at one point it was going to have to be a CISO level person. The current title is called the program coordinator. What they said is you've got to have a person. Okay, and I'll just tell you, I think this largely comes from some of their enforcement actions where they realized after digging into this that there were 3 or 4 people and each of them had a different responsibility ultimately, and they were all saying, it was his fault, it was her. They want one person who is ultimately responsible. Now, you don't have to be an expert in everything. You can delegate duties. There's no particular extra liability personally for you, but you do have to be qualified. So you have to take some special training. You have to be capable of understanding the systems and the risks in your systems at your store. So that depends on the level of your sophistication, your size, the type of data you have. I mean, dealers have sensitive data, they really do. And so you are already starting at a pretty high level of urgency and importance. So you've got to have someone who's competent. You can outsource it if you want. You don't have to. But you do have to have someone inside who's supervising the outside person. So ultimately, you're going to need to develop a little bit of in-house expertise. Again, it doesn't have to be someone who's necessarily an IT expert, but they are going to have to be trained specifically, and they are going to have to do their annual report to the board or the dealer principal. So there is some responsibility that goes with it. And I think it's not the kind of thing you can just say, to your office manager, in your extra free time, go do this, right? You're going to have to dedicate, I don't know if it's one FTE, but at least a part of an FTE to doing this throughout the year. That's the qualified individual.
Right. So one key point I'd like to add to that, you can outsource it, as Brad said. However, you cannot outsource your responsibility.
Correct.
Right? That it's still a dealer's responsibility. Even the outsourced qualified individual must be held to a high standard by the dealer themselves.
That's a perfect point. And then, Brad, did you want to add to that?
I would just say that's probably one of the biggest questions we run into is, dealers say, okay, is this you guys? It's like, well, we can be the qualified individual, but somebody in your organization has to step up and take ownership and understand what's going on. You can't just say, okay, I wrote a check, I'm done. I mean, there has to be, some internal diligence and ownership, and nobody wants that. The controller doesn't want it, the CFO doesn't want it, everybody's already got enough stuff on their plate. So unless you've got, a sizable group that's got, some sort of risk compliance officer already, who's stepping into that role and understanding, dealers are just having a really hard time throwing a dart to see who wants to wind up, getting this responsibility.
From an ADA's perspective, hopefully dealers will take this in the right, frame of mind coming from we're dealer advocates, we're doing what we can to help you. We certainly have commented on the nature of this when the FTC issued it. But make no mistake, that's why I mentioned earlier in particular that board report. Why are they doing that? It's because they want to specifically make sure that there is no, plausible deniability at the highest levels of the dealership. So remember that the fact that it's almost, regardless of who you appoint the qualifying individual, you as the dealer principal, you as the board member of the dealer group are going to really have to, up your game. You just are, and it's not everybody's favorite, but it's the reality. I mean, think of it when you go to your bank or your credit union, right? How you expect that to be treated, how data is treated, how seriously they take it, what a high standard they're held to. They're basically saying you're held to basically the same standard as a dealer because of what you do. So it's going to require some investment in time, effort, energy, and attention.
When you talk about risk, you've got to look at the different types of risk. As we were saying earlier, you've got the risk of consumer information. You've got the risk of a network breach that affects that information. You've got the risk of what your employees are doing. So you've got to kind of break it down and say, okay, overall risk assessment is incorporating all of these things. So let's say we start with the physical layer. And we say, okay, what are we looking at from a risk of our network being breached? What security tools do we have in place? Who's monitoring them? How are we locking this down? How are we keeping bad guys out? How are we, content filtering? All these different things to kind of help lock that piece down. And then from an employee standpoint, how are we training our employees? What is our risk of employee doing something? Literally stupid is probably the best word I can think of that I tell dealers. You remember the commercials for insurance where they had mayhem?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, I always tell dealers, look, stupid exists in your dealership. It's going to happen. All right. The best thing we can do is to make sure when it happens, it's a 30-minute experience and not a 30-day experience. So, we look at the physical layer, we look at the personal layer, of employees, and then we look at just the operationals. What are we doing with our vendors? What are we doing? Do we know where all of our data is? So we even understand what our risk is, because we got to figure out first, where's the keys to the kingdom and where's our crown jewels? Yep. And if we don't know that, then we don't know how to protect them.
No, I think that's perfect, because Nikhil actually mentioned earlier, rather than, responding to it in, 30 days or 30, he said within seconds, it can at least be contained to where now it's not touching 200 PCs where you're lighting a match, like you said earlier. So
I'll add a little more, right? So what Brad was describing, understanding the threats, the problems, you've got to assess all of those. You have a list of that. Then for each one of those, you look at 3 additional pieces. What's the likelihood of that problem becoming reality? What's the impact if it does? And what's our response plan? Not after, what are we going to do now to control those risks to an acceptable level? So you put those columns together, the problems or threats, likelihood, impact, and the plan. That together is a risk assessment and needs to guide the entire security program.
And I'm jumping in real quick again. Let me just clarify something. Hopefully dealers listening realize that since 2003, when this rule was issued, you've been required to have a risk assessment. What's different now is it's required to be in writing, and it's required to be done periodically. Okay. Again, ask yourself, why is that? They want a record. They want you to require you to really dig it out and look at it, and they also want you to write down what you've done. Now you can ask your lawyer why that you think he or she thinks that they want you to write it down, but you could probably realize that it's to hold your feet to the fire. And the other thing I'll just mention is, we always tell folks is be expansive in your risk assessment. Dealers, look, we're tons of creativity, very good at what we do, not always thinking about the risks involved when they do it. So, we talked about this earlier. If you've got salespeople taking pictures of driver's license on their personal cell phones or calling consumers on their personal cell phones or texting them or whatever, you've got to think about that as part of your risk assessment. You have got custody control as a dealer of that data. And frankly, you shouldn't be doing that, but you should be centralizing those things. But you got to look operationally at how you do things, where this data may live, and think broadly. It's not just your DMS, your CRM, or your websites, although it's certainly those things. It's all, it's tier 1, tier 2, 3 of websites. If there's credit apps being taken on different websites, it's your salespeople's cell phones. Obviously, it's physical documents as well. We talked about this. Most dealers hopefully have locked F&I offices and locked cabinets, but we do hear stories that stuff is still left around and not treated with the care it needs to be. So think broadly when you do that risk assessment. You're going to need some, IT expert help, but it's a lot of this is really just you got to have a handle on what the heck is going on at your stores, because the stuff is floating around just because the chaos of life and the way that cars are sold. I know it can be tough, but you got to get a handle on these things.
So I'm gonna punt this one to Brad Holton. You'd brought up third parties, vendors, things like that, documenting your security plans. This is definitely one that I'm curious about. So do dealerships have to do this on their own? Can they go get some help? If
Yes,
they do,
and yes.
Okay.
I'm going to say, if you're a large public, or you're even a large private, you've probably got the resources to dedicate, some full-time guys and girls that are going to go out and do this, and they're going to be able to have the resources. They're going to be able to do the training, the constant, continuous training, to be able to always stay up on the latest and understand that, the current cyber threats. You're going to be able to monitor things 24/7. So you'll be able to do the risk assessment and build out your whole team. But at the same time, I've seen large publics that outsource all this because they just don't have the ability in-house and the knowledge in-house to do it, and they don't want to take the time to build all that. So can it be done? Yes. Is it likely to be done? No, not internally.
So, adding to the likelihood situation here, to be good at cyber response and understanding what's happening on a network, you need a couple of different things. You should see a wide volume of attacks. You should see a wide variety. And a single business doing them by themselves is just not likely to get that breadth of exposure. In addition, the monitoring has to be 24/7, not just an alert sent to a cell phone to a guy who might be sleeping, and you hope he wakes up, right? It's got to be to an online awake group of individuals qualified to look at this data and make a decision. Is this an escalation? Is it not? Right? So for most businesses, having that knowledge base with the volume and variety, having a 24-hour staff, shifts running, it's not that practical. For larger enterprise groups, probably it can be done. But for the smaller groups, even mid-sized groups, it's not that practical. So outsourcing is a responsible way to meet the requirements, and it's cost effective because the outsourcing partner gets to spread those costs across customer base.
And you mentioned monitoring, and I'm going to throw this to the group, and I know Brad Miller, you probably have some more insight on this as well. But monitoring has been mentioned in the previous amendments, I believe, and now is it going to a different level of monitoring, or are there certain stringent policies put around the monitoring in these amendments?
Yeah, there are new requirements. They get a little complicated. This is the IP side of things, because you can either do continuous or you can do penetration testing. You can do, there's sort of some choices you can make, and that's part of the risk assessment process. But yes is the answer. The answer is, we didn't say this at the start, but the way this has changed is for 20 years we've been operating on, you had to take steps that were reasonable to protect the data. That was basically the standard, right? And so that changed over time as what was reasonable changed, but it was also very amorphous and difficult, frankly, for the FTC to bring enforcement actions because everybody thought what they were doing was reasonable. And so the FTC responded by saying, okay, we're going to tell you these 20 things at least are reasonable. And if you need to do more, you probably have to do more, but you have to do at least these 20 things. And that does include some systems monitoring requirements as part of it. So there are a couple choices you get to make, if continuous is required, or if you want to do pen testing, or both. But that is definitely one of the added requirements. And I'll just add on the last point. I just want to make this point because from the dealer perspective, we're sitting here in September. Dealers have been working for many of them for 8, 9, 10 months on compliance. What we're finding right now is that as much as they're buttoned up internally, they're starting to now face that issue I talked about at the start, which is they also have to reach out and make sure their service providers are doing the things they need to do. And we're hearing some mixed responses on that. Now, remember, a couple of things I'll just tell you. There's no exception for your OEM partners, despite what you may be told or you may think. So if you're sharing that sensitive data with them as a service provider, there's going to need to be some changes to contracts and changes to policies, and you're going to need some information from them. And I know that's not easy, but it applies to all of your service providers and all of your OEM partners. If the circumstances fit. So this is tough. This is tough for 17,000 dealers to do with the dozens of vendors that they deal with. So again, I'm hoping that we'll continue to work, and that maybe at next year's show, hopefully there'll be some vendors touting their compliance with these new requirements to make life easier for dealers. But I wanted to just recognize that reality, because the dealers out there are saying, well, that's great, guys. You guys are talking about all these things, but I can't really get what I need from the third parties I'm dealing with. And so we're working to try to help folks with that. And we would just encourage dealers and vendors to keep working together on that.
You've mentioned MFA, correct? And can you explain some of the things that we're doing as we get into that world of that acronym, and what does that mean? And
Sure. So Brad talked about the vendors having their requirements, right? And dealer must ensure that the vendors are supplying those requirements. So one of those requirements mandated in Safeguards rule is MFA, multi-factor authentication. So I'll break that down. We've all been using passwords for a long time, right? But passwords are old school. They've been shown as an ineffective tool to secure data, because humans will do what's easy, right? So you will pick an easy password. You'll use the same password across a number of systems, because that's going to reduce your mental load of logging into dozens of things. We all have so many things we log into in our lives. So password reuse is a very common thing. And consequently, password theft is a very common thing. Okay, so back to MFA. So the password is one factor, something that you know. The idea of multi-factor authentication is adding a second factor. There are different kinds of factors. It can be something that you have, like your cell phone, which might have special codes on it. It can be something that you are, your biology, your fingerprint, iris, those kinds of things. Those are much more expensive because they require dedicated hardware to implement those kinds of checks. So the most common way of doing multi-factor authentication is password plus something that you have. It can be a token, it can be a cell phone which has these codes, and you use both of those together to sign into an application. Right. And so an attacker without that second factor will not be able to pretend to be you and compromise your account. That's the idea behind it.
you mentioned data encryption, you mentioned MFA. We had a question that came from one of our dealers pre this call. We asked them to submit some questions, and one of the dealers asked, is Reynolds going to put data encryption in writing that we're protecting them with data encryption?
Oh, sure. So we've had encryption for a while. MFA is being rolled out now, so already dealers have screens where they can get set up, the people set up for MFA, and it'll go live later in the fall. But all the things that we are doing, encryption included, we'll write out for you in a packet. You can download the packet, and it'll have how we are providing the tools you need to comply with safeguards.
For all of our viewers out there, you can download all the FTC Safeguards playbook information on rayray.com. Obviously, Brad mentioned earlier that NADA has some great resources and downloads that you can go through as well. So now that we're kind of through those two things, I'm gonna start with some of our dealers' questions that were submitted specifically. Will Reynolds and Reynolds be ready for these amendments, and will the DMS be ready with items like MFA authentication, right?
Yes, of course, we will be ready. There's already several of the requirements already met. Some are still in progress, but all of those that we need to meet will be met before the deadline and give dealers enough time to implement those changes. Like MFA is a significant project to get everybody enrolled, and get the cell phones enrolled in the program. So it takes a little bit of time. So we're going to be ready ahead of time to give dealers time to get all of this work done.
I'm going to flip this one to you, Brad Miller. So one of the questions was, do you have an example of what an acceptable CISO report would look like, or what it would be? We don't have one to share on the screen today, but if you can kind of walk us through or talk us through for our dealers that are online with us watching this, what that might look like.
Sure, and I think it used to be called the CISO report. Now they just call it the board report, which is good. It was one of the few things the FTC listened to our comments on, which was please don't make us a CISO requirement. But so we're talking about the board report. Basically, as I mentioned, it's one of 4 documents you're going to need, and what it really is an update on both sort of where things are and anything that's happened in the systems over the last year, because you have to do this annually. Okay, and you have to, it probably is going to be the qualified individual doing this. It doesn't have to be, but it probably is. But we've got a template in our guide, by the way. If you want to, again, you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. don't just take our templates and put your name on it and say that's it, but at least we'll give you a place to start. What it's doing is saying, okay, the board, here's the status of our, here's what we've done to date. Here's the status of our information security program. Here's any issues we dealt with in the last year. In fact, the rule is a little unclear, but if you have a ransom attack or some big issue in the year, that may require you to do something even more frequently than annually. But the idea is to keep them aware of the status of the risk assessment in the program and anything that's happened in the last year, any big changes, any big issues, anything that you've discovered that needs to be addressed. So there's a lot more detail, or at least a sample of it. I mean, a lot of these reports, they kind of give you broad topics that you need to address. They don't hold your hand through what exactly it has to say. But that's essentially what you have to address in this report, at least annually to the board. And again, if you don't have a board, it's the equivalent governing officer of the dealership.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think you'll see that agendas are probably going to change when it comes to these kind of things. It's not going to start with how many cars did we sell and how many cars did we service. It's going to be, did we stay out of trouble this month? So I think that's a great example of exactly, where we're going with sort of the board reports or dealer principal reports and things like that. So I'll transition to the next question, which I'm going to throw this one at Brad Holton. The question is about how much is this going to increase expenses at a dealership?
It really depends. If the dealership already has, to use Nikhil, good cyber hygiene, and you're already doing the things you should be doing to qualify for cyber insurance, and kind of you're proactively on top of your cybersecurity, it's probably not that big of an adjustment to add the compliance paperwork piece with it and the vendor assessments versus, if you're not doing anything, if you're operating your 5-store group like it's a buy here, pay here lot, to be able to put everything in place and to get all this stuff done in time. I mean, it's a significant undertaking if you've not been focused on cybersecurity.
Obviously, it's not a cheap endeavor.
Right.
But what's the cost of not doing it? Right? Besides the compliance issues associated with that, what's the cost of a ransomware attack on a dealership? It can be enormous. The ability or inability to purchase cybersecurity insurance because you don't have these basics in place. These are all going to be extra costs on the business that can be avoided by having a good security program and working with good partners.
Yeah, one of the things we're seeing, right now is that because cyber insurance, they've gone up 100% to 300% year over year the last 2 years on their rates. And they're doing that because they jumped in the business, all these different companies did, and completely misjudged their risk. And so now they're having to go back and say, okay, we really lost money for a couple of years, let's make it up now. But 2 years ago or 3 years ago, a cybersecurity application was 1 page. What's the name of your dealership? What's the address? Where do we send the invoice? Can you afford to pay us? Yes. What's your revenue? That's it. It's 1 document. Now it's 7 to 8 pages. And it's asking all the same questions that the FTC is requiring. It's asking you, do you have endpoint detection or managed text response? If so, which vendor? And it gives you 5 or 7 vendors to choose from. And if it's not one of those vendors, it doesn't qualify. Right. You're not getting insurance. Right. Do you have multi-factor authentication, especially on remote VPN access? Because that's how the Colonial Pipeline ransomware event happened, was a remote VPN. So they're very focused on that. If you don't have multi-factor on remote VPN, you are simply not getting cyber insurance in most cases. So, seeing those 2 things kind of lined up, when you take the cyber insurance document, you put it here and you put the FTC here, it really makes a compelling case for dealers not only to pay attention to FCC because you're getting mutual benefits, you're also now qualifying for cyber insurance, whereas, if you didn't do this, you wouldn't be able to qualify.
Costs aside, and we actually did a cost study of this in our comments, and I'm glad to see that the market's sort of responding in terms of providing these services. I always caution dealers, and I'm sure Brad wouldn't say this, but a vendor who says, hire us and you'll be compliant on day one. Just be cautious. Okay. The nature of this is not write a check and you're compliant. It just isn't. You've got to change some things that, as you'll see when you look at our guide, if you haven't, or watch the video, watch the webinars, the policies, the cultural issues, the training, all of those other things are things that you as the dealership are going to have to do. So great that there are vendors that you can trust. Just be cautious with someone who's making promises saying, well, hire us day one, you'll be compliant, because I just don't think it's going to work that way.
So Brad, let's stay on that same topic. Dealers not compliant, not being compliant. What's the implications to that?
It's complicated. And I was, we're not chicken little on this in the sense that I don't want to overplay it. Here's the complicated legal answer: there's no private right of action under Graham Leach Bliley, which is the statute that this is issued pursuant to. So in other words, someone cannot sue you directly saying you don't meet the safeguards rule requirements, so I'm suing you. That's my cause of action. But there are tremendously stiff penalties from the FTC, 46,000 something per violation. Everyone says, what's a violation? I'm not sure. I think it's generally per consumer. So you can do the math on that. It gets pretty steep pretty quickly. To be clear, and I'm going to get in the legal weeds for just a minute. What the FTC has to do is bring an enforcement action against you. You enter a consent decree, which is expensive and terrible enough. And if you violate that, then they can issue fines against you. So it's actually a two-step process to have those fines kick in. I think the more likely and higher risk relevant issue for dealers today is that in many states, what happens is you can be sued by a class action plaintiff's lawyer under state law, and they say, oh, the basis of our state law class action is this violation of federal law. So what they do is they bootstrap a violation of the safeguards rule under a state law class action. Okay, what does that all mean? That means you could get sued if you fail to do this. You also can get sued if you have a data breach anyway. And frankly, that's also happening. If you talked to me 2 years ago, data breach class actions had a bit of an uphill battle because most judges were saying, well, you haven't really established any harm, there's no standing, but that's changing. Courts are really recognizing these as valid causes of action, and that's why every time there's a breach, you see a class action that comes, and the first thing they're going to ask you is, where's your safeguards compliance? So it's a long, complicated answer to say, I don't want to overplay the risks, but I do think the risks are real. And what you don't want to do is, if you have an issue, not at least be able to give them those 4 documents I talked about and show that you've done the basic things that you need to do to comply, because then you're in no man's land, right? They can always second guess your decisions that you made in your risk assessment, but if you haven't done anything, then you're really going to be in trouble. So it's a complicated question, but that's essentially what the landscape is.
So for all the dealers watching out there, we greatly appreciate you tuning in. Hopefully this was informative. Hopefully it was helpful. Thanks for all the dealers that submitted questions. The questions were great questions and very consistent with lots of other questions. If we didn't answer your questions today and you have additional questions you'd like to ask, please submit those. I'd also love to say thank you to Brad Miller from NADA who joined us today. Nikhil, thank you so much for joining us, and Brad Holton, thank you so much for joining us. All the insight was greatly appreciated and hopefully very helpful, so thank you.